Hello, Dave Security. My name is Breanne Boland, and I work in product security at Gusto, and I'm here to talk to you about Appsec horror stories. Like ghosts, security vulnerabilities are the result of us going about our lives, doing the best we can, and then experiencing things going awry, as usually happens. We plan systems, we build software, we try to create the best teams we can, and yet there will always be echoes in the world from our suboptimal choices. These choices can come from lots of places. Work not being double-checked when a large decision is at stake, a committee losing the thread, or worst of all, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. That's right, security issues are a natural side effect of creating and using technology. Today, though, we're going to talk about the energy signatures, cryptids, orbs, poltergeists, strange sounds, code smells, and other things that go bump in the night. That's right, we're talking about security horror stories. Get your flashlight and I'll meet you by the campfire. Before we get started, though, here's a little disclaimer. Everything I'm about to talk about is something that I've encountered in the course of my work. I've just put a light veil of fiction on it. It's just professionalism and good manners with a little dash of superstition. I think the universe tends to punish arrogance, so I'm not pretending I'm immune to any of this. No one is. It's why Appsec exists at all. But let's get to the haunts. Our first monster, I'm starting with one that's probably still fresh in everyone's minds, and I'm mentioning it first because it's such a dramatic betrayal. You think you're doing the right thing. You're doing the thing your security team told you to do by keeping your software up to date, and then suddenly you hear a familiar name in the news and you have an incident on your hands. And the monster I'd compare it to, it's like getting stabbed with your stake when you're trying to kill a vampire. I thought we had a good thing going, and then suddenly... And how to identify it? Ideally, it's by responsible disclosure from a company, but realistically, it might be CNN. Such is the way of supply chain attacks. And we invite it in by doing the right thing, because using components, tools, and libraries with known vulnerabilities is in the most recent version of the OWASP Top 10 for a reason. This problem comes from the tricky balance of keeping everything updated. It's the old ops versus security argument. And I'll tell you a story. Once upon a time, a couple jobs ago, we were suddenly having trouble with a couple types of servers. Ansible was behaving itself, but things weren't working after the hourly server update. After an intense afternoon, some of my coworkers narrowed it down to a dependency that hadn't been updated after a really long time. It had had no new releases for ages. It wasn't even what you call a load-bearing library, but it was important enough that there'd suddenly been a breaking change. The problem was solved by pinning the requirement to an earlier version and then reverting the update. My own sad little contribution toward this not being the state of things forever was to make a ticket in our deep, frozen, iceboxy backlog saying to revisit it in 6 months. I was an SRE then, but I was already leaning toward security, and I was a little perturbed by this resolution, but there honestly wasn't a better solution that day to keep business going. Although, it did get fixed later. My coworkers very sweetly reached out to me and let me know about that. And this has become one of those stories that doesn't haunt me exactly, but it stays with me when I review code or a web UI and come up with an old version of server software or a dependency. Even if it doesn't have a documented vulnerability, not throwing the parking brake on until it's updated to the most recent major version feels like doing badly by our future selves, even if it's what makes sense that day. The best way to fix this one? Pay attention to changes, check hashes on new packages, and generally pay close attention to what's flowing into your environment. It isn't easy, but it's the best we've got. Our next monster, the horrors that lurk in free software. And the monster I'd compare it to is bringing a Ouija board in the house that you found on the street. And I'm going to pause here for a second because, to be honest, this is my favorite little piece of art I made for this presentation, so I want us all just to sit with it for a moment longer. Thank you for your indulgence. How do we identify it? Listen for yourself or someone near you saying something like, "Look at this cool free thing. Thanks, Captain Howdy. I'm so much more efficient now." Question everything that's free, especially if it executes on your own computer. How do we invite it in? It's really hard to resist something useful and free, sometimes even if you know better. And a particular problem with Chrome extensions is that you can't publish them without automatic updates enabled, so someone has a direct line to change code in your browser as long as you have it installed. So last year, the Great Suspender, which was a pretty popular Chrome extension for suspending tabs and reducing Chrome's sometimes considerable memory usage, it got taken over by malicious maintainers, and then people who had once upon a time done their due diligence were still sometimes unpleasantly surprised. And that's the tough thing about evaluating some of these. You have to consider both the current risks, permissions used, things lurking in code, but also the possible future ones. What happens if this program is installed on 500 computers that all have access to your company's shared drive, and then suddenly it goes rogue? It makes it difficult sometimes to be something other than that stereotype of security, the endless purveyors of no. But a small risk across a large enough attack surface ends up being a much larger risk, so we have to weigh these things. In short, I think of it as like the Facebook principle, where if you're getting a service for free, you might consider you're actually the product and not the customer. And security isn't necessarily handled as carefully for the product as it is for people who pay. Pick your conveniences carefully and prune them now and then. Or you can get fancy if you control it within your company, and you can consider an allow list model rather than a block list. Make conveniences prove themselves before you bring them in the house. Our next monster, overly verbose stack traces. And for this one, I quote the eminent Appsec engineer and author of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty. The demon is a liar. He will lie to confuse us, but he will also mix lies with the truth to attack us. So logs and stack traces contain the truth, right? They're there to collect context and provide you information to make things better. Logs, they're great, except when they get out of their cage, or when they contain information that can be used to hurt you. How do you invite it in? You add values to debug statements that don't need to be there, or you write endpoints so that errors can spill big old stack traces that tell on you, or you leave debugging mode on anywhere once you've deployed, or you just haven't read up on OWASP's cheat sheet on security misconfigurations. How do you fend it off? Conjure a good culturally shared sense of safe log construction and remember what shouldn't be in logs or errors. Secrets, PII, PHI, anything that can hurt your users and anything that can get you sued. And make a commit hook that checks for debug anything. Our next scary thing, API keys and other secrets in code. For this one, let's quote Ursula K. Le Guin. To speak the name is to control the thing. And the monster I'd compare it to is when the Fae has your true name and can control you. How do you identify it? Read your code. Is there something in there you wouldn't want any old person to see? Then yank it. Use less sensitive identifiers like internal account numbers if you need to, or just move on to AWS Secrets Manager. Just don't hard code the thing that lets someone pretend to be you or one of your users if they have it. How do you invite it in? The best incantation I know is, oh, it's a private repo, it'll never matter. Or, oh, it's a key that's not that big of a deal, it's fine if it's out there. How do you fend it off? Safe secret storage, and not depending on GitHub as your only layer of security. Because look, we all want to do it. It's way easier than responsible use of environment variables or adopting a legit secret storage system. Who wants to spend time caring for and feeding a vault cluster? Come on, it's just our servers. It's not a big deal. It's only deployed within our private network. It is a big deal. It is my job to tell people not to do this. Today I will tell you for free, don't do this. And I have had to argue with people about it sometimes. It still surprises me, but people do really just want to get their job done. As a security professional, it becomes your job to help them understand that saving time now can create so many time-consuming problems later. It's great to have a commit check that looks for secrets, but even better is never ever doing this. And best of all is both, just in case. Our next fright, a single layer of input validation for your web UI. I quote Zombieland, always double tap. And the monster I'd compare it to is anything tenacious. Let's say zombies, vampires, hydras, anything that travels in a pack. You get it, just look at all those heads. That is a tenacious beast. And how do you identify it? Sick burp suite on it. Maybe the form doesn't let you put a little script tag in, but the request itself might be only too happy to oblige. And how do you invite it in? By getting a little complacent. But you can fend it off by remembering that regular users aren't your real threat, and you're probably just irritating with people with names that don't meet the definition of normal that some shoddier validation will catch, which can do some awful racist stuff. There's a reason that injection, especially SQL injection, is a perennial member of the OWASP Top 10. So, say it with me. Client side and server side, input, validation, and sanitation. Then add appropriate encoding too, depending on what you're doing with this input. Most people do only interact with your server on your front end, and you know what? Bless them. But the thing is, the world is filled with jerks like me, both professional jerks and people who are jerks for fun, and we will say, hey, directly to your server. Never take only one measure when you can take two. Our next monster, technology that will never leave us. The monster itself, think ancient WordPress, old versions of Windows running on an untold number of servers, a certain outdated version of Gunnicorn I bumped into once, and other software with published CVEs. And the monster I'd compare it to, well, I'm not going to say its name, am I? And you can identify it sometimes by listening for the phrase legacy software, although newer projects are not immune to this. And you invite it in by saying something like, oh, we're really focusing our budget on new features right now, or something like that. And you can fend it off by allocating budget to keep your stuff updated. Seriously. Because look, no tool, framework, or language is bad. All of them have issues that need to be considered when you're using them. There are still valid reasons to use XML, and PHP is a legitimate language that just needs to be lovingly tended, I swear. Yes, we are back at the risk of using components with known vulnerabilities from the OWASP Top 10. No tool, framework, or language is bad, but some versions have known problems, and some tools have common issues if you don't work around them. It's not on them, it's on you and how you use and tend your tools. The real incantation to keep this one away is understanding why we keep these things around. No engineering team keeps their resident technical debt nightmare around because they like it. They do it because it's worked. And rewriting things is expensive and finicky, especially if outside entities depend on your services. I've never been on an engineering team that didn't have lots of other things to do rather than address the thing that mostly hasn't given them problems, even if none of the engineers without vivid memories of the 1990s understand it very well. Sometimes the risk of breaking changes is scarier than whatever might be waiting down the road once your old dependencies cause problems, or someone on the outside realizes what your house of cards is built on. Our next monster, overly permissive content security policy. And the monster I'd compare it to is when someone says, oh, I found this old book, let me try reading it out loud, what a laugh. And we can identify it by well, fortunately, a content security policy is a lot easier to read than inspecting every old leather-bound book someone might drag into your house. How do we invite it in? Sometimes the risky choice just seems easier that day. You need to run a little code from a CDN. You just want to get this thing to work and make updates easier for your client. All these good intentions. How do we fend it off? I would gently urge you not to put anything in your CSP that literally contains the word unsafe. And I do really understand that there are workarounds that can make sense in the moment, when you're dealing with a tricky problem, when you just need a little flexibility to make the thing work. In that case, I urge you to follow my quarantine problem-solving process for moments when you need to figure something out or finish a task but the brain won't cooperate. First, have you eaten recently? If not, please do something about that. Second, does this just feel kind of impossible right now? If so, set a timer, work on it just for a set amount of time, I like 15 or 20 minutes, and then stop. When your brain knows that you can stop, sometimes it gets more cooperative. And third, can you think around this usefully right now? If you're having trouble with that, try writing out your questions. Get as specific as possible about your unknowns. I would suggest starting with, why do I think unsafe eval is the best option right now? And how might I persuade myself otherwise? Look, it's hard to make things work safely. You have to be a glutton for punishment to do this work, even if you love it, and I usually do. But you can't just say yes to everything because of future-proofing or whatever feels like a good reason today. Influenced by your last month or so of work pains, maybe. You can't do it. I'm telling you, as an internet professional, not to do it. Because your work might go through my team, and I will say, not today, Internet Satan, and then you're back at square one anyway. Speaking of no tool, framework, or language being bad, it's in the water. Let's talk about JavaScript. Specifically, JavaScript used incorrectly. And the monster I would compare it to, it's a little 12 monkeys, it's a little cabin fever, oh god, it's everywhere, it's unavoidable, it's a global pandemic. Oh no. And how do you invite it in? Internet. Anything internet, it'll be there whether you think you invited it or not. And how do you fend it off? Just be very careful, please. Look, I'm not going to make fun of JavaScript. Once I was a child and enjoyed childish things like making fun of JavaScript. Okay, that was like 3 years ago. But now I'm an adult and I have quit my childish ways. Or I made myself do it somewhere between when I realized that mocking other people's tech is not actually an interesting or useful contribution to a conversation, and when I became an Appsec engineer, so roughly between 2016 and the end of 2019. But the point is that the internet, and thus life and commerce as we know it, runs largely on JavaScript and its various frameworks. It's just there. And there have been lots of leaps forward to make it much less nightmarish, thanks to the really hard work of a lot of people. But still, things like doctor's appointments and vaccination slots and other really important things and giant matters of safety and well-being hang out on top of the peculiarities of a programming language that was created in 10 days. And unfortunately, new dragons will just continue to appear because that's the side effect of making things. New features, new problems. The great thing for Appsec that's an unfortunate thing about humanity is that we make the same mistakes over and over again, because if something worked once, we want to think we have it sorted. And unfortunately, the internet and technology insist on continuing to evolve. How do we fix it? Invest in security. Sorry. I like how we do it at my current job. We have a security team, but it is our specific job to work closely with all the rest of engineering. That way, engineers get to learn all the cool security stuff, but they always have people who do only the stuff to help them out. There's always someone available to take a second look at things, and most of us become sharper when we're honed by other people's ideas. And now we come to our last monster. Excessive permissions, especially AWS ones, which to me brings us right back to where we started. The monster I'd compare it to? Sleeping unprotected in the woods when you know they're full of threats. And how do you identify it? Check your IAM role permissions. That's identity and access management. And yes, this is totally a broken authentication issue too, a la OWASP. How do we invite it in? The best way I know is by starting out as a smaller shop and then moving from a team of, say, 3 people who do everything to 30 people or 50 people, all of whom have greater and greater specialization, but your permissions never evolved. And how do we fend it off? Make roles early. And I know it's hard. It's not a change that enables a feature or makes more money. And worst of all, as you refine the roles, reduce access, and iterate, you're probably going to piss a bunch of your coworkers off for a little while. IAM, it's the monster that doesn't need a clever analogy because getting it right sucks so bad on its own sometimes. It's also the monster that lurks around basically every corner because IAM is ubiquitous. So it's everywhere and it's endlessly difficult. Awesome! But we have to put the work in because messing it up is the best way I know to undermine so much other security work. Look at that. The face of the beast itself. And yet I feel warmly toward it because IAM was my gateway into security work, and it's the thing I tend to recommend recommend quietly to the security aspiring, because most people don't like doing it very much. But the work always needs to be done, so just showing up and being like, IAM, I'd love to, is a highly distinctive professional posture. So get your crucifix ready and have some incantations at hand, and you will never run out of things to do. It is never not useful. Sorry, it's just like the rest of tech. If you're willing to do the grunt stuff and get good at it, you'll probably have work for as long as you want it. That's a lot of things that go bump in the night. Let me give you something positive. I want to leave you with some good general strategies for your vulnerability ghost hunting. First, be easy to work with. And this doesn't mean being in a perpetually good mood. I am not, and former coworkers will attest to this if you ask them. But it does mean reliably not killing the messenger. People outside of your security team, including and especially people who aren't engineers, are your best resource for actually knowing what's going on. Here's the thing. If you're a security engineer, people don't act normally around you anymore. You probably don't get to witness the full spectrum of people's normal behavior. Unfortunately, it just comes with the territory, and it means we have to rely on people telling us the truth, even when whenever they see something concerning. And the thing is, even people who are cooperative with security will hedge a little sometimes when dealing with us. And I know this because I've done it. But you'll reduce this if everyone knows that talking to security will be an easy, gracious thing where they're thanked at the end. Make awards for people who are willing to bring you problems instead of creating a culture of fear where things get covered up. Make people feel like they're your ally and a valued resource, because they are. Next. Okay. I kid with this, but really, being able to communicate, especially in writing, is so important. Whether it's vulnerability reports, responsible disclosure, blog posts warning other people about haunted terrain, or corresponding with people with security poltergeists. Being able to write clearly for a variety of audiences is one of our best tools. If you think you're losing your grip on how regular people talk about this stuff, bribe your best blunt, non-technical friend to listen to you explain things. Then have that blunt friend tell you if what you just said to them makes no sense. Then revise it and explain again. Do this until you're able to explain things in plain language accessible to your users and spur them to action using motivations that make sense to them. And then I ask you, try to stay endlessly open. There are strategies and principles that we can reasonably guess will continue to be valid for a long time. Principle of least privilege, anyone? But we exist on shifting sands, and being open to change is so important, and way more fun too, actually. Don't become a calcified pillar of salt that exists only as a warning to others. We have to constantly learn and evolve. Stay nimble. And we're lucky this stuff is super interesting, so we just have to keep pace with our material. We made it through. We've emerged unscathed from the forest once again. I hope you encounter none of these terrifying creatures and phenomena that I described, that your trails from server to server in our increasingly connected world are paved with good intentions and mortared together with only the best outcomes. But should you wander into dark woods full of glowing red eyes and skittering sounds belonging to creatures just out of sight, I hope you're better equipped to recognize and banish them than you were earlier. Thank you very much.